Katheryn Gronauer, welcome to the Tokyo Living Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks very much for coming on. For the people that maybe don't know about you, perhaps you just provide a little bit of background on your growing up and what you've done so professionally up until this point, and what you're up to now.
Sure. So, where to start? I'm originally from Florida, from West Palm Beach, and my mother is Japanese. So, I grew up living back and forth between Tokyo, specifically Itabashi, which is pretty close to the Ikebukuro area on the northern part of Tokyo. And my family's in the bathhouse business here. So, I actually grew up going to local bathhouses every day whenever I was in Japan. And so that was kind of an unusual upbringing here in terms of being here in Japan. Yeah, and I officially moved about 13 years ago. And I came here for university and I kind of forgot to go home after that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I wound up just working here in Japan and I started a business originally doing health coaching and it really segued a bit. And right now I do transition work. So I primarily help people who are new to Japan live and work here. And I work both with professionals and help them on the business side, learning about cross cultural education. And I also help families transition to just kind of building their routine here and building connections and networking and that type of thing.
Very cool. And so, what were you doing before you started this business?
Yeah, so I was actually working for an international concierge.
Okay.
So I was that person who picked up the phone whenever someone from Amex or, anyone who has like an Amex, black card or one of those like elite card holders, they would call the concierge service on the back of their card. And I would be the person who's picking up. And I was helping a lot of expats living locally here and also a lot of travelers coming to Japan. And I worked on some, really simple things like just restaurant bookings, but all the way up to really complicated requests like helicopter, going from helicopter from city to city and that type of thing. So it was a really interesting job.
Yeah, yeah. And what sort of prompted you to make the move? I guess to go into health coaching and to start your own business.
Yeah, that's a really great question there because I was really loving the work that I was doing at the concierge, but we had a change in leadership, and I had with the previous leadership, I was really kind of molded and I was really growing a lot. And they sent me to a lot of different countries and offices where I was helping with internal communication. But under the new leadership, I had a conversation with the director talking about my future career goals. And she said, "Oh, well, I don't see why we'd have a foreigner in a management position." And I was like, "Oh, well, that kind of just ends the conversation there." It wasn't like, well, maybe management, maybe you should manage teams, maybe you can do training, or maybe you could do, account management or something like that. It was really just like, I don't really see any reason to promote a foreigner. And so yeah, I felt really stuck because I was like, wow, I really love this company, but I just don't feel like I have any room to grow. And at the time I had actually already been doing a health coaching certification on the side because when I first came to Japan, I was learning a lot about macrobiotics and I lost 40 pounds.
Mm,
And I was really fascinated about sharing with people Eastern and Western holistic nutrition concepts. And so I kind of felt like that was an opportunity where I had, a few different options. Either I could stay in the company and have no upward mobility. I could try to go back to school, maybe get another degree and try something else, or I could switch into a different industry and essentially have to take a pay cut and start over because when you've worked in an international concierge, there isn't really another equivalent a role that I could kind of segue into. So I kind of felt at that point that it wasn't really that much riskier to start a business. I thought, okay, I just start a business. And if it doesn't work after a couple of years, I can always just, pick one of the other options that I would have done anyway.
sure.
So yeah, that's kind of how I decided to start a business. And that's also why I decided to get into health coaching.
And how did you go about doing that? How did you get started?
How did I get started? So oh, you know what? Well, first of all, I jumped ship, which I don't recommend people do before you've built up connections. So yeah, I just kind of took a leap of faith and, I quit my job and I started everything from scratch. I did, a lot of got really down into the rabbit hole of online marketing and connecting with different organizations. And yeah, I started to get some clients, and I was working with people one to one and working on their health and their wellness. And eventually, I started to realize, especially working with people who are local in Japan, foreigners in particular, a lot of the health oriented questions that were popping up were things like, okay, I want to get healthy, but like, what is miso? Or like, where do I buy quinoa? Or, just really like basic things that they didn't know how to do. And I was realizing that they were having a lot of struggles with just day to day things. Like, people just did not know how to live here. And especially people who are living like in the Minatoku area where it's very international, they weren't really exploring beyond Toku, like they didn't really understand, what it was like to live in Japan, and really struggling to kind of build their lifestyle here. So I was like, you know what? Why don't we just do some orientations where I can just help you like figure out how to like shop in a grocery store, or like, how to just do your basic stuff. And I was surprised at how many inquiries I was getting for that. And I was like, wow, people really need more fundamental support here. And, on the kind of emotional side, I was also hearing people struggling with working professionally. They felt like, they weren't really fitting in with their companies, or they were kind of having some cross cultural issues, or just, feeling like a lot of homesickness and culture shock, those types of things. So, my business really evolved over time. And, I've been working a lot more with corporations now for cross cultural training, and also just one to one, coaching work to really help people both professionally and personally.
Mm, yeah.
Mhm.
And yeah, I guess talk a little bit more about that side of the business.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing to be working on with people and with companies.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Yeah, so again, it just kind of started with, people starting to ask more and more questions about culture. And yeah, I started doing some corporate work and doing some cross cultural training. And I was finding that, some of the core challenges that I was hearing from people were all very similar.
Mm,
So it's all, related to communication issues. A lot of times people are struggling to get feedback. So they feel like they're doing something wrong, but nobody in their company is telling them what they're doing wrong. So there's this kind of like feeling of unease. A lot of times people feel like they're really excited about making new contributions, but they're feeling like it's falling on deaf ears. So people are listening to the ideas, but not really implementing them. They also feel like business moves too slow in Japan. So, wondering why the pace isn't going as fast as they want it to. So these are just kind of like some elements that I typically hear, and it doesn't really matter where that person is in their career. Like, they could be in the C-suite, they could be a director, or they could be someone who's like a new manager, first time manager. They all seem to have similar issues.
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
so I guess just going into a little bit more depth on those that you've mentioned. So the feedback, do you think that sort of relates to how Japanese people give feedback? And do you think it's something that's specific to the workplace, or is it a cultural thing that's sort of embedded in people from a young age?
Yeah, it's kind of a combination of each of those elements. So, in Japan, it's a hierarchical society. So it's pretty difficult for people to give feedback bottom up, because especially if it's related to performance. So it's one thing to just, talk about a topic and maybe give some suggestions on how to move a project forward, but it's another thing to kind of tell your boss like, "Oh, you're not doing this right in Japan. Like, this is not how we approach things." That's something that's very awkward for someone in a subordinate position to kind of bring to light. So you often find people. Actually, one guy, I thought he really explained this well. He said, "Sometimes I feel like I'm in a meeting." He's a director. And he says, "I feel like I'm in a meeting and like everybody's watching the train about to crash, and but they're not saying anything." So
Yeah.
yeah, he feels like he's doing something wrong, but it's not quite there. But sometimes it's not the right environment for people to give feedback. Another element is people expect feedback in group settings. And in Japan, oftentimes it's really hard to give feedback or open, candid opinions in group settings. And that's also a part of like the hierarchical elements as well. So sometimes just doing one to one conversations with people that kind of helps open up. more conversation. So it's a little bit of the cultural elements, but it's also about like the method, like how do you go about gaining feedback? That's also part of it. One woman I'm working with, she said that having just like anonymous survey feedback forms has been really helpful for doing presentations. So she'll do a presentation, and at the end she'll ask people for feedback or for Q&A, and nobody will raise their hand. So instead she just gives kind of simultaneously like a feedback form, and she's always really pleasantly surprised to see how much insights she gains from those forms, because it makes her feel like people were really engaged with what she was delivering. So yeah, just trying to tweak the method of how to get people engaged.
Yeah. And so is that does that tend to be more specific with people in higher levels of management, not receiving feedback from those below? What about people receiving feedback from those above them? Is it again that they're not receiving feedback, or it's just not delivered in the same way that they're used to?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So since I work mostly with foreigners, I would say like you either have someone who's in a director position who's a
Mhm.
foreigner, or you have someone who is working underneath a Japanese boss or Japanese manager.
Yeah.
And I think that the issue that people who are working under a Japanese boss is that sometimes there's a misunderstanding of like expectations. Like people have different understandings of what they expect for performance. Like what is high quality performance? People define it in different ways. So, maybe a foreigner might define performance as someone who is taking ownership, taking accountability, who's very fast, someone who doesn't need to be told what to do. Like those might be the ways you define someone who's performing well. Whereas in Japan, you might define someone who's performing well as someone who shows up, someone who's a team player, someone who is offering to help others, someone who is coming to those nomikais, every time that someone who'll come in on a Saturday and who won't ask if they're gonna get paid overtime. That type of loyalty, those elements. So I think that, it's hard for maybe Japanese managers to kind of communicate what their expectations are, because they don't really know where the gaps are and how, performance is being measured. So, aside from just like tangible things like targets, also trying to identify like what kind of soft skill qualities people are looking for. That's really important for both ends.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, just a question that sort of comes to me now. Do you
Yeah.
also work with Japanese people and doing the opposite, having them understand more of the foreign perspective? Is that something you've worked with as well?
Yes, I do that as well. I would say that my work, the bulk of my work, definitely is aimed towards foreigners transitioning to living and working in Japan. But there's always times when there's mixed groups of participants in workshops where there's both Japanese and non-Japanese participants, or in some cases where I do like one-to-one work with Japanese people as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it's interesting. I think that usually when I'm doing a cross-cultural training for foreigners and there's Japanese participants, a lot of the Japanese participants find those trainings really interesting, because they're like, "Oh, I didn't realize that people see Japan this way," or "I didn't
Mm,
realize that certain things that I thought were normal or that were common sense are actually not common sense to other cultures." So
mm,
people don't really know how to define like, okay, what is common sense, but what is actually cultural. I think that's the gap. So one example I can give you is things like trash separation. So like a Japanese person might be like annoyed at someone who's not separating trash, but they don't realize that it's cultural in Japan to have a very like robust recycling system, whereas it might not be the same in other cultures. Whereas something like taking off your shoes at a Japanese home, Japanese people identify that as being a Japanese thing to do. So for them to kind of know like what is Japanese and what is not, or what is just like, cultural, I think those are the things that they don't really know how to identify until those trainings happen.
yeah. Yeah. Do
Yeah.
you find that there's different challenges, and do you enjoy working with the Japanese as much as working with the foreigners? And is that something that you maybe want to do more of going forward, or do you think that you offer sort of more value working on the other end of the scale?
I do. So I enjoy doing both. I think that what I've been doing the bulk of has been definitely for foreigners adjusting to living here. But I think that Japanese people kind of need a different type of support.
Right.
because for most Japanese organizations, it's about like how to be global, or what does it mean to be global, or what is global communication, like just those kind of like surface level understanding of how companies might operate internationally. Whereas for most foreigners in Japan, it's about, how can I still kind of make the impact I want to make, but kind of adjust it in a way where I can work with Japanese people or work in Japan. So their kind of end goal, I would say, is a little bit different.
Yeah. Yeah. Going back to one of the other things you mentioned before about like slow progression in terms of like decision making and things like that. That's obviously something that I hear a lot, that people
Yeah.
struggle with. Um, do you, is it when you're working with foreigners, specifically in relation to this, is it more about just building their understanding of why that's the case, or are there some specific strategies that you offer people to try and deal with this and to make that easier?
Yeah, so I think that explaining why is really helpful. But usually, first of all, I like to start with one question, which is, okay, what is the rush? So I find that, I think that when people from outside Japan are really used to their fast pace, it's really hard for them to just kind of learn how to just be a little bit more relaxed in their new environment. And because they have that expectation that things need to be done at a certain pace based on their experience other places. So that's usually what I ask is, okay, what is the rush? Like, why does it need to be done by Friday as opposed to like next Wednesday? Like, why? Like, where is that coming from? That's usually a place where I like to start, is just trying to identify, like, where is that coming from? But beyond that, I think just, helping people understand more about what are the things that are impacting why it's taking a while, is really helpful. So part of it, again, is related to things like hierarchy
Yeah.
or, consensus based decision making. These are things that really add a time lag. Japan is a really kind of an unusual or unique culture where it has a combination of being a hierarchical society, but that's also consensus based.
Yep.
So most people think that a hierarchical society is top down, like the director just makes a decision and everybody follows. But Japan is actually consensus based. So in relation to other cultures. So that really affects communication. People have to have a lot more meetings to try to get to the right person to talk about elements, but also being respectful of others. So they might wind up having a lot more meetings to kind of cover one topic. They also tend to be more risk averse, so they like to really thoroughly think through a new topic and really think, what is plan B, C, and D, like not just what is our first step. So, most people from global organizations, international people, they usually like to just think of like what is the first thing that needs to get done, and then they kind of make adjustments along the way. Whereas in Japan, it might be more like trying to think through all the possible challenges that might come up and how they can execute it right from the very beginning. So, yeah, I think once people kind of get that, high level understanding of like what the thought process is, it really helps them relax a bit to understand that, we're all on the same team, we're all on the same page, we all have the same goal, but just the execution is happening a little bit differently because of cultural things.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm jotting down notes here as we go
Yeah.
along, and other questions. It's really interesting stuff. Do you find that then, if you build people's understanding around that, that they're able to sort of flip it and use that consensus based decision making to their advantage and improve outcomes, or is it just a matter of understanding and just knowing where that's coming from, and then just sort of dealing with it?
Yeah, I think for them, ultimately, like basically people are just trying to look how to reduce their stress. So I think that this type of training really helps with like just overall stress reduction, because a
Yeah.
lot of the stress comes from just not understanding why. Like you see people doing something, but you don't understand the why. So once they understand the why, then they can kind of, make a little adjustment. Maybe they set their deadlines a little bit differently because they're like, okay, now I understand that, my Japanese peer has to talk to all of these other people. So maybe I need to kind of adjust my timelines. So it really helps them kind of understand either how to either adjust themselves or how to initiate a conversation about trying to get other people to understand why things might need to happen a little bit quicker, those types of things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, you a minute ago you said that a common question you ask people is, "What is the rush?"
Yeah.
For me, I think like this is one of my weaknesses, that if there's something on my to-do list, it needs to be done now. I think,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm a fairly busy person, and my concern is that if I don't do something now, by the time it comes around to getting something done, there'll be something else that requires my attention, and that's why everything needs to be done and needs to be actioned right now. What are some of the other responses you get to that question in terms of what's the rush?
What's the rush? I think,
Yeah.
it really takes people off guard because I think that once you've kind of spent many months seeing people do things as what you would define as slow, you start to build up this anxiety. Oh, it's slow, it's slow, it's slow. So by asking that question, like, what's the rush? I think, again, it really kind of gets people to realize, okay, maybe maybe I'm the one that's putting all this pressure on something where it's actually happening at an okay pace. And I'm not saying that's for everything because of course Japan does. There are elements where in Japanese culture things do work a lot slower. But what I am saying is that it might not have to be as fast as you think it needs to be.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think that one person I was talking to was a really interesting conversation, and she was saying how uh, she realized that her energy in the company has kind of shifted because when she was working in Europe, it was always about what am I doing for my career? What is the next step? How am I making an impact? And really trying to make sure that her actions were in alignment with certain targets or certain metrics that she could use to further her career and get the next promotion, that type of thing. But since coming to Japan, especially in a place or especially in an environment where it might be more based on like job rotation, where people are not as like career hungry because
Mm.
they're in a system where they're going to be rotated throughout different departments anyway. She said that it really she had to kind of think how she could kind of step back a bit and just allow herself to kind of be involved in the work and not think so like end result oriented. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, One of the biggest, I'm going to say challenges, but no, it's complaints that people have working in Japan is that Japanese people just can't change. They're sort of fixed in their mindset, and there's no sort of leniency. Um, is that, in your opinion or from your research, a result of the decision making process that in Western cultures and particularly probably in the United States, people tend to make decisions very quickly and then have the ability to change those decisions later on. Whereas in Japan, they the decision making process is very thorough, and like you said, they go through that plan B, C, D, E, and so that's all sort of thought out in advance, and that's why once those decisions have been made, they're sort of fixed. Or are there other sort of aspects of Japanese culture and Japanese business that lead to that sort of lack of flexibility? And I guess, yeah, how do you have strategies that you get for people to deal with that? Sorry,
Yeah,
it's a
so
loaded question.
this is a really big question. So, well, usually I like to start by saying that if you think in the course of history, Japan was closed borders by until like the mid 1800s, right? So like around 1850, I think it's like 1853 is when they like opened their borders. So if you think about it, Japan went from being completely closed off, like no foreign residents, like completely closed country, to opening up, going through two world wars, completely rebuilding from scratch since, the mid 1900s, and is now like a leading world economy. And even in the last 2 decades, has the immigration rate has tripled. So we now have the most ever foreign residents Japan has ever had in its history, and it's a world like leading economy. So if you think about it, this has only been like around 170 years, like from the mid 1800s to now, and Japan has gone through a lot of change, from like opening up to other people, trying to be more competitive on a global scale. So in the scheme of things are happening pretty rapidly. And I know someone who has a grandmother is 100 years old, and she was raised by people who know about that closed border situation.
Yeah.
So, if you think about it, these generational things, like we're still living with people who kind of recognize a lot of change that has happened. So I think, like, if you look in the scheme of things, like, there are elements where Japan has made a lot of rapid change. But when it comes to kind of certain, like, how current work processes and procedures are happening, I would say that there is resistance, depending on what the topic could be, or depending on, the industry, or depending on the work that people are doing. So I do think that a lot of that really comes from a mix of consensus and hierarchy. I think that sometimes there are companies that have trouble initiating change because, just one person in the group is like really opposed. And because they have a certain type of status, it's really hard to kind of, get that person on board. So those are some things that can pose as obstacles. And I also think in other cases, sometimes people just think, oh, well, what I'm doing is already fine. Like, I don't really see the purpose for change other than the fact that, you know, we just think that the change is better, but
Yeah.
what's already wrong with the current system. So to give you an example, like, I had a brief stint working in an accounting department while I was part-time while I was starting a new job. And they were using accounting software from, like, I wanna say, like, 2007, maybe, like, 2007 accounting software. It was around that time. And, the company on a global scale was saying, look, we need to update this, this accounting software. Like, all of our other offices are using this updated version. You need to do it too. But then the accounting team was like, well, first of all, we're like way over capacity with work. Like, we don't have time to learn how to use this new system. Second of all, we already know how to use the old system and we do it really well. Like, we're very efficient with it. So I don't really see, like, the pros to just, you know, putting on all this extra work to go through training and fulfill all of our requests and try to, like, know how to use this new tool. And since it's accounting, you can't make mistakes, right? So you can't there's really no, like, opportunity to kind of, like, make mistakes as you're trying to learn how to new program,
Yeah, sure.
along with, meeting client requirements. So things like that, it was I think a lot harder to try to get people on board. The company had to explain a lot more about how this new software was going to actually make their lives easier, and also maybe try to address, okay, how can we kind of split up the workload so that, some of the people could learn the new tool while the others were fulfilling based on the old tool. So they had to kind of, like, adjust how the execution was going to happen. um yeah, so, just seeing things like that, like, I think there's just needs to be a kind of a different approach taken to the change initiation.
Do you ever sort of work with people that have been in the Japanese system for a certain amount of time, and they come out of it and go back into a Western setting, and they find that they've actually, taken some skills and taken some of the Japanese business practices and culture and actually applied it and found that it's beneficial to apply back into a Western setting? Have you ever sort of come across that at all?
So, I mean, I do know people who have been working in, Japanese organizations for, like, a couple of decades or more. And I have heard some people make comments like, they thought that they're very international, but then when they start working with other organizations, they realize how they've actually kind of adopted some Japanese mentalities
Yeah.
through that. I would say that the main thing I hear about is, like, quality control. So trying to make sure that they're doing a thorough job. So
Mm.
you usually notice this a lot, where usually, like, in global companies, it's about kind of producing kind of like a first iteration, and then things can be kind of tweaked along the way. But I think just trying to make sure that things are done more thoroughly, that's definitely something that I think people pick up from being in Japanese organizations. And you really notice it a lot more when you go outside of Japan.
Yeah, yeah, that makes complete sense. And also just trying not to bow to cars, that stop and let you cross
Yeah,
the road when you're packing your home car.
I know.
Yeah,
Yeah, I definitely have that tendency.
just talking off air before we got started, I was sort of mentioning that in my own organization, when we started, it was mainly sort of Australians and Japanese with, a few North Americans sprinkled in there. And now we've got this mixed bag of Irish and Italian and Swedish and Norwegian and people from all over the place. And that's fantastic. And I think I love being in that sort of multicultural environment, but it does sort of pose a few communication challenges. And I've just sort of finished working through the book, The Culture Map by Erin Meyer, which is offers some fantastic takes on that. How does people's experience working in the Japanese environment differ if they're coming from what is sort of described in this book as a low context environment, like United States, Australia,
Yeah.
UK, compared to perhaps somewhere that's a little bit more high context, like parts of Europe. And
Yeah.
if you find that you have to work with perhaps European people in a slightly different way than you would with someone from the United States, for
Yeah.
example.
Well, I will say that most people, no matter where they're from, so whether they're from a low context or a high context culture. So basically, for those who haven't heard of low context and high context, low context basically means that you use explicit verbal communication. So, like when I say yes, I mean yes. And when I say no, I mean no. So it's very explicit. Whereas high context means that you're using other methods of communication. It could be your body language, it could be some sounds that you make, maybe you speak kind of indirectly, so people have to read between the lines. So that's more of a high context culture. So basically, no matter where people come from, what I find is that they have learned how to be more low context in global organizations. So because when you're speaking in English, you basically are learning more of a like a low context way of communicating with people.
Sure.
And technically, if you are working in multicultural teams, you should be trying to aim for more low context communication because people can't pick up on everybody's nuances. So, using direct, explicit communication uh, methods like verbal dialogue or text based communication is helpful for people across cultures. So, the problem that pretty much everybody faces when they come to Japan is like one of the most high context cultures. And a lot of people in organizations, even Japanese people who are communicating English, sometimes they don't realize that they're still using Japanese nuances, even though
Yeah,
they're
for sure.
speaking in English. So even something simple like saying like, oh, that would be difficult. Like, if you translate it into Japanese and say muzagashi, that means
Yeah,
like, that's
impossible.
not happening. Yeah.
Yeah,
We're
exactly.
not doing that. So whereas, people from global backgrounds, they usually hear that would be difficult as, oh, there's a possibility if
It's a
we
challenge.
change something. Yeah, it's a challenge. Like, how can
Yeah,
we make it work? That's what
yeah,
we
yeah.
hear. So, yeah, I would say that that's probably a big challenge because, without a lot of, companies in Japan really doing training to understand that they need to do more low context communication when they're communicating in English. I think it's really hard for Japanese companies to pick up on. Um, yeah, that bridge needs to really be, or the gap needs to be filled. Probably more from Japanese people trying to make that effort. I would say.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
We actually spoke about this sort of stuff in a team meeting during the week, and one of my staff gave a great example of the indirect communication was someone saying, "I really like your watch," and they just interpreted that as, "Oh, they like my watch," whereas he was actually trying to say, "You're late." Um, yeah,
Yeah, you're
at
late,
this
or
time. Yeah,
yeah,
you're going
yeah.
overtime. We need to wrap this up.
Or I've
I
heard
think
people say like, oh, your shirt is such a bright color, bright pink, but what they're saying is like you should not be wearing a bright color like
exactly.
that, like you should be wearing black or something like that. So, yeah, that's kind of it's weird because what we say is indirect. It's actually kind of passive aggressive.
It is, yeah, yeah,
You know?
for sure.
So we're saying passive aggressive is basically what we're talking about. But I have one tip actually for if you're trying to communicate with people across cultures
Mm,
is to ask open-ended questions. So a lot of times when people are getting frustrated, be it in Japan or across cultures, what we tend to do is we tend to ask more yes or no questions. So, you're like, okay, I don't really understand what this person's saying, but okay, which is it? Are you doing it or are you not doing it? Like, just give me a yes or a no, and, they try to get somebody to commit to one or the other so that they can kind of move forward. But that's actually not good in a high context culture, because in a high context culture like Japan, there isn't a way of saying yes or no. There is no explicit yes or no. Everything is gray. So the more yes or no questions you ask, the more vague responses you're going to get. So what's really easier is just to ask open-ended questions. So for example, instead of saying like, can you finish this report by Friday at 3 o'clock? Which is a yes or no question, you could say, okay, what is the soonest this report can be finished?
Yep.
When's the earliest that you can finish this by? So that opens up the opportunity for the other person to elaborate. And when they elaborate, then you get more clues into how they're thinking. And yeah, you could just follow up with more open ended questions. So start with one open ended question and keep asking more open ended questions, and you'll probably get a really good scope of how that person's thinking.
We've talked predominantly about sort of communication within the professional environment, but you also work with sort of general population. Well, I say general population. That's a sports medicine term. But you work with people on more sort of the social interaction and sort of everyday communication as well. What are some of the? I mean, I'm assuming it's similar sort of issues, but I guess they may present differently. What are the things that people mainly struggle with from that perspective?
So you mean like
The
outside of the
workplace,
office,
yeah.
outside of the workplace? Oh, that's a good question, actually. Most of the things we talk about are not necessarily communication based, because, most people I've come across who are transitioning, like they're not at a stage where they've really learned Japanese. And
Mm,
if they're not in the workplace, they're usually not interacting with people who, are speaking English. Like
sure.
if you're out and about, you're probably making friends with people who are international. So it's really more about like self-sufficiency is the things that I would help people with outside of
Okay.
the workplace. So just how to be able to be confident about doing what you need to get done without feeling like you have to rely on everybody. One woman I talked to, I thought it was interesting. She said ever since moving to Japan, she feels like she's 7 years old. Like she can't fend for herself. She has to ask so many questions, and at the end of the day, she still can't get things done. Like, she's been to 3 different post offices just trying to mail something and not understanding why it can't be mailed, and, those types of, things. So it's really like, I like to call it adulting. It's like people are learning how to be an adult again. Like, they have to relearn how to work their washing machine. They have to relearn how to take transportation. So, and that's really frustrating for people who are adults. You're used to being like in control of your day to day. So it's about just kind of giving them that confidence back.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I guess one of the similar things that people might encounter is just how everything is very rigid, and I guess when they're dealing with you bureaucratics, going to the ward office or immigration or
Yeah.
something like that, that things that those sort of places would be a little bit more lenient on in the West, they're not so lenient on in Japan, and that can cause a lot of frustration. Um, do you find yourself having to, I guess, use some of the same explanations that you would in the business environment to get people to understand perhaps why that is the case in Japan? I know um, one of my staff actually had an issue where they needed their birth certificate for something, um, and they said they didn't have the original, and it's like, well, you need the
Yeah.
original. Okay, why do you need the original? So that we can make a copy. So, well, I have the
Like, well,
copy
I can
here.
make a copy. Yeah. Uh-huh.
We need the original. Oh, why do you need the original to make a copy? But I've got a copy, and that sort of thing would probably not be as rigid in other parts of the world. Yeah,
Yeah.
how do you get people to sort of be comfortable with that?
I think it really just comes down to expectations. Like once people understand what to expect, that's what helps alleviate
Yeah,
any, issues. And of course, like these things, it's very bureaucratic in places. I mean, even I was just updating my foreign registration card, and it took me 45 minutes at the bank just to tell them like, oh, my expiration has been extended,
yeah,
extended. So yeah, and you just never expect it to take that long. Like I had allotted at least an hour anyway, but I was thinking, oh, like of all the things I've done at the bank, like this should take the least amount of time. But
yes.
it still took quite a while. But yeah, again, I would say like just letting people know ahead of time what to expect. Like, look, this might take a little longer, or they might ask you for things that you don't understand, but it's really about their kind of like quality control, whatever process they have set up, it's not meant to make sense. It's just meant to be executed.
Sure.
So, yeah, those things, I think that's what's really helps people at the end of the day is just setting that expectation for them.
Yeah, makes sense. All right. I mean, there's some fantastic information there, and I've taken a page of notes. But before we start to wrap up, are there any sort of, I guess, final tips or nuggets or interesting perspectives that you have on sort of Japanese culture that you think people would be interested in, or even if people just sort of moved to Japan, we're likely to get an influx of new foreigners, hopefully in the next few months. If people are just arriving, do you have any sort of one or two big pieces of advice that you give people?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess my advice, I mean, if you're listening and you're planning to move here, or you just moved here, I would say like definitely try to get support sooner than later. I think the biggest obstacle I see for people is they usually when you arrive, you're in that honeymoon phase, so everything's really new and exciting and interesting, and but you start to run into little what feels like little problems here and there that honestly really build up over time into this huge ball of frustration. So,
Yeah.
I'm always meeting people who have been here for a couple of years and they're like, "Oh, where were you when I first came here?" Or like, "I really wish I had someone." But if you meet someone who's just arrived, they're like, "Oh, no, I'm fine,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm fine right now." So it's I think trying to find that kind of medium is difficult. I've actually found it for that reason to be easier to work with corporations because the corporation can already establish and put into place that support program that a person needs. But, I got to tell you, like on average, the average amount of time someone's been here before they reach out to me for personal help with business culture is 3.5 years.
Wow.
So imagine being here for 3.5 years and, the first year being totally clueless, the second year trying to make changes and not understanding why it's not happening, the third year just trying to, recognize, okay, maybe I'm the one who's not understanding what's happening here. That's a really long time to be kind of in the dark about things. And, the average amount of time people have been here before asking me for orientation support. So just simple things like learning how to shop in a grocery store is about a year and a half. So imagine just being completely clueless and lost and, afraid to take public transportation to go places, like those types of things for an entire year and a half. It's kind of mind-boggling if you think about it in the time, but it really just takes that much time to really feel like you can kind of get somewhere, feel that you're at a point where you can really reach out for support. So, yeah, I would say, sooner the better.
Well, I mean, I think that's a fantastic segue into if
Yeah.
people either have just arrived and want to get a jump start on understanding, the Japanese culture and how that they can sort of exist and thrive in this environment, or if people are 3.5 years down the road and really struggling with this, how do they get in touch with you either personally or from a corporate perspective?
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. So you can just go to my website. It's thrivetokyo.com. Thrive, THRIVE, Tokyo, TOKYO.com. Or you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I would say LinkedIn is the best platform to reach me at. So it's just my full name, Katheryn Gronauer.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
Do you do any other sort of socials? Any say Instagram, Facebook, Twitter?
Yes, I am on Instagram and I do have a Facebook page as well for Thrive Tokyo. So it's
Okay,
Thrive Tokyo dash Katheryn Gronauer.
okay.
But I would say I'm definitely more active on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn.
And if you send me a message on LinkedIn, I'm more likely
Sure,
to see it and respond.
sure, sure.
Yeah.
And I guess you've been on sort of other podcasts, and I know you've done a TED talk as well. A really
Yeah.
interesting perspective on your family's history in the bathhouses, and
Yeah.
what you've got out of that experience, which was super interesting. So we'll put some of those links in the show notes. So if people want to hear more of your content, they can just go to those links and have a watch and have a listen there.
Great. That sounds perfect.
All right. Well, Catherine, thanks very much for your time. Super interesting. There's stuff that I know I'm going to sort of apply in a professional sense, and I'm sure the listeners got a lot out of it as well. So thanks very much for your time, and yeah, have a great rest of the day.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.